full of just being displaced and kind of where we are and having to deal with all the things that are coming up. So if creativity is something that is a pursuit that is a luxury, it's only for a select few who have the resource for it, or it's something that I don't have room in my life for until I have a little bit of leftover space, which I'll probably wind up just using to sleep because I'm exhausted, how can we embrace creativity, let alone creativity as a state of liberation? So here's sort of my proposition. This is what I propose to kind of bust this myth. And this is the idea that creativity, rather than being a luxury, creativity is the immutable birthright of every human being. I think it's the immutable birthright of all creation, to be frank. Everyone is creative. Every single human being has untappable amounts of creativity. The question is, are we aware of it? This creativity is meant to experience, we're meant to experience liberation and growth as human beings. We're meant to experience justice and societal evolution, all those kind of things, through creativity. Another way of saying it is imagination is a free and abundant resource. And if you're not sure about that, just watch a child at play. I mean, kids at a certain age, young kids, if you engage them out of a place of imagination, if you walk up to a child and just go, look out, the floor is lava, like, it's real for them. They're there. Like, they don't have to be convinced. They're like, because what? They're going to play with you, right? So you watch a child at play, and imagination is always on tap. Even when it's bedtime, even when they should be exhausted, they're imagining new ways to avoid bedtime or get a glass of water, those kinds of things. So then what happens? Why do a lot of us kind of become less imaginative or struggle with our imagination as we become older? I propose that one of the biggest reasons that we tend to kind of, in a way, almost grow out of our imagination is because of all the ways that we learn to cope with the wounds and pain that we experience as we get older. Life is challenging. Life is not pie in the sky. It's not easy. Creativity is not easy. We'll get to that. But as we get older, we go through things, and we start to learn to cope. So we become increasingly aware that the world is a scary place. I think some of our earliest thoughts and wounds and things that we experience, pain, if we can remember back being a child, has to do with like coming into the very harsh realization that this is dangerous. Being alive is a dangerous thing, and things can surprise you. So we start to learn to control what we can in order to avoid pain, and we become more and more afraid that we'll not be able to control. So what do? We try even harder to control, right? And so we develop all the little things that we do and all our little idiosyncrasies and narratives that we write for ourselves that help us to feel like at least I have something in my life that I can have control over. Why? Because if I don't, I'll get hurt, right? So I believe that if there is an antimatter or like a kryptonite to creativity or imagination, this anti-creativity is fear. You could substitute the word anxiety there, depending on what you identify with more. Why would I say that? I think that anxiety is essentially creativity that's been hijacked by fear. Anxiety is like your imagination got pulled over the side of the road. Fear stepped in and said, "Get out of here! I'm taking over, and I'm going to run this show." Why would I say this? I think about when you're really at your most anxious, right? Anxiety is incredibly imaginative. Anxiety is all about experiencing scenarios and narratives that we invent and we imagine in our mind, and they feel very real, and so therefore we do things to try to avoid these things that haven't happened yet, right? And I know that this might be an oversimplification. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm just sharing you with what I've learned about these things. So we invent these scenarios and narratives in our minds that are not real. They're things that have not yet come to pass. And our anxiety makes them so real that we behave as though they are real. So we make believe, right? we're imagining. We're just not in charge of our imagination. Fear is, right? And it's using that creative resource to generate all manner of things. So in some case, this can become so strong that we actually manifest the imaginary reality that we're trying to avoid. And we call this self-sabotage. I believe it's probably happened to every single one of us. That there's something we're so fearful of or so like trying to manage things against that might happen, that has not yet happened, that what happens is we actually set the stage for it to happen. So think about that. In a lot of ways, we're talking about the imagination manifesting something, making it real. So I'd like to propose that we don't lose our imagination or creativity. We don't become less imaginative as people. We don't become less creative. Our imagination and creativity just gets enslaved to fear. And it continues to work overtime in the background of our lives. Creativity isn't something that we lose and need to somehow buy back as a commodity, which I think the West tries to teach us. Well, if you had this, you'd feel more creative or fulfilled, or you'd experience joy, or whatever those kind of things. Buy your way into freedom, as it were. But really, creativity is still there in a very potent way. It's just been enslaved by fear, or our fearful tendencies, because the world's a dangerous place, and we're trying to cope, and we're trying to figure out ways to deal with it. And so that core motivation starts to find imagination and goes, wow, this is an inexhaustible resource, and I can fuel my preventative measures in life and all the things that I do to try to avoid pain with this amazingly potent resource. So why am I saying it this way? Why am I talking about these things? I'm speaking from my own personal experience. So I want to share with you just very briefly sort of my story of creative recovery, which is not finished. The credits haven't rolled. It's still going on. But thinking back to 2016, about a year in from my family moving back from overseas. We lived overseas for 13 years, and we were sort of kind of like, coming out of quarantine and thinking, what's it going to be like? And it's not the way that it was. It's something new, yet it's familiar, and all that kind of stuff. I have friends that are really anxious about coming out of quarantine because they realize that they've become used to not being around a lot of people, and there may be introverts to begin with, and that's going to be a hard adjustment, even though at the same time they long to be with people. So anyway, 2016 was probably the darkest year of my life to date. I was crashing really hard. I was hitting rock bottom because of what I know now as a prolonged living with chronic anxiety and depression, although I wasn't aware of it. And the coping mechanisms that I generated in my life to be able to deal with life up to that point suddenly weren't working anymore. They weren't achieving what I had developed them in order to achieve. Things were starting to break down. So I just thought that this was how everyone experienced life, right? Especially when you're living that way your whole life, you don't know any different. And so you don't know what's going on. You start to doubt yourself. Maybe I'm defective. Maybe I can't cope with life. Maybe I don't have what it takes. And then suddenly everybody else's life seems so much better than yours. Well, what's wrong with me? Why do they seem to be this way? And why am I living life in the way that I am? So when I finally started seeking help, there were a couple of really transformative things that happened to me, that came into my life. The first thing was through the advice of a counselor that I was opening up to, and through just some different scenarios that had been going on. I sought my doctor's help and said, I don't think what I'm experiencing is normal. And ultimately that led to a diagnosis with generalized anxiety disorder and clinical depression. And this was, for me anyway, this was a very transformative thing. So it was like somebody came along who was a professional and said, hey, guess what? Your brain chemistry is broken. That's why you're experiencing things the way that you are. You're not defective. You're not wrong. You're not a terrible person. It's just like if you had broken your arm, we need to fix this. We need to set this straight and get your arm working the way that it should be again. So what this diagnosis meant that I've learned since then is essentially means that the chemical fight or flight response that gets triggered in a certain part of your brain that releases chemicals, for me it just meant that it was triggered by everyday normal activities. Just waking up in the morning and walking outside, something could trigger that. And in my brain, when that gets triggered, it just keeps ramping up and doesn't get shut down like it normally should be. So it gets triggered when it shouldn't be triggered, and then it just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning until eventually either I'm too exhausted or I'm able to distract myself from it. So that kind of sucked. I didn't like that. But I was prescribed some medication that helped this chemical imbalance in my brain. And really, I'm not saying that this is the way it needs to be for everybody, but this absolutely changed my life, 100%. Suddenly, what I had been taught all my life about spiritual practice, about prayer, suddenly started to click into place. It was like, oh, wait, I was only experiencing 30% of what this is supposed to be experienced like in my life. And as soon as those things started to be made right, I developed enough space. My counselor said it brought the waterline down to here so that I actually could benefit from things like therapy, having a spiritual path and spiritual practice that I was walking. So it changed my life. There was a second thing that came into my life that came in right about the same time that was incredibly transformative for me. It became sort of a journey that was a very transforming story. And that was my sister-in-law, Brita, introduced me to a book called The Artist's Way. And I don't have time to get into this book and all of what it is, but what I will say is it introduced me to daily practices of what the author calls creative recovery. And I'm just not talking about art therapy and that sort of a thing. This is something different. And it helped me to begin to, now that I was in a place where my brain wasn't constantly spinning out of whack, I was able to overcome some of the addictions to fear and control that was learned behavior, so that my imagination could be my friend again, right? And what I learned was I actually needed my imagination to go through this recovery process. And I would dare to say that it's not a process that ever ends. I think that's part of actually what it is to live and to grow. It's this creative recovery. It's this experiencing more and more of who you are. But it definitely brought me to a place where I felt like I could live my life and enjoy who I was. So it really taught me to put creative self-care first. And so creative self-care, as I'm describing it this morning, that now brings us into a lot of what we've been hearing and talking about in this Lenten season, right? Liberation and creating space in our lives for daily practices that are going to help us experience more and more of transformation. And creativity is something that we're making a part of the Lenten experience. So all of that to come full circle and say, that's what I'm talking about this morning. So some of these creative self-care practices that I learned were things like creative play, just taking time to play and do something imaginative and creative. And also a daily creative exercise that was free from results-oriented thinking, right? To be able to do something that was playful and enjoyable, that for whatever period of time I'd set aside, even if it was 10 or 15 minutes, was free from the need to evaluate its productivity, right? And that, for me anyway, like radically transformed a lot of things, even my experience of the divine, even my experience of prayer and those kinds of things. So in the midst of that, I would say that it's totally reframed a biblical text for me. And I'm going to read it for you, but then I'm going to reread it kind of in the light of what I'm sharing about. And don't worry, we're kind of already 2/3 of the way through what I want to share this morning, so this is not the beginning of my message. A lot of times the beginning happens when they get to the Bible verse. I do my Bible verse at the end, okay? Just like when George Lucas took the traditional credits of the film and said, we're doing them at the end now because we want to have the Star Destroyer and all of that. So that's what I'm doing this morning. Don't freak out. Okay, so listen to this text. So the Apostle Paul is writing to the very early church in Rome, and he says, so here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embrace what God does for you. What God does for you is the best thing. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing that you can do for God. So don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what God wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity. Boy, are we living in a time like that. Always dragging you down to its level of immaturity. Instead, God brings out the best in you, develops well-formed maturity in you. All right, so now I'm going to reread it, and I hope I'm not rankling too many people, okay? I'm going to substitute the word for God with the word creator, okay? And just read it that way to kind of frame it in maybe a way that maybe rhymes a bit more with what we're talking about this morning, but really a lot of how I was experiencing this. So here's what I want you to do. The creator helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before creator as an offering. Now, I'd like to invite you, for that word offering, think canvas or clay. We get so serious about the word offering, and immediately we can slip back into dutiful, product-oriented thinking, right? Has to have this end result. It has to be this thing. And because it's a sacrifice, because it's an offering, it means I have to hate it. So if I don't hate it, then it's not spiritual. No, think when he says present it as an offering, think of it, present yourself as a canvas or a piece of clay ready to be molded. Embracing what the creator then does for you is the best thing that you can do for creator. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your imagination on the creator. You'll be recreated from the inside out. Readily recognize what the creator wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, creator creates the best out of you and creates well-formed maturity in you. I think the best way to learn creativity, because it is not merely a talent, it's something that we learn and develop, is to allow yourself to become a creative medium, right? You become the canvas, you become the paint and the clay and those kind of things. And the Bible is full of analogies like that, right? So when I allow myself to be recreated, I think it starts to teach me about what the creative process is like. And I can talk for days about what the creative process is like for a painter or somebody who likes to draw or create visual art. But I would dare say that there's nuances that are going to be different for someone who loves to write or loves to garden or finds creativity in numbers and pattern recognition and finding unique solutions in those kinds of scenarios. There's all different kinds of creativity. All right, so what did what I just described look like for me? And just kind of finishing up, how did this creative practice or this kind of recreation of my life through imagination and kind of befriending my 7-year-old self again, how did that work? So here's just some practical recommendations that I want to share out of the overflow of these are things that I learned to do in this time that I was talking about. So number one, first of all, before I even get into these two things, I want to say as a disclaimer up front or as a kind of overarching statement, if you're in a state where you are totally overwhelmed right now, that you're like, I can't even think about this stuff because of crippling anxiety or depression or whatever state of overwhelm you're experiencing, number one, seek help and trust the people who love you. You will get nothing out of trying to pursue some sort of a evolutionary practice or something that's going to help you grow on your own if you're in that kind of a state right now. So reach out, get help. Just like for me, it was like all these things that were supposed to be working for me didn't really seem to be working, or they only working to a point. And that's because someone who loved me told me, your water line's up here, you're drowning. We need to at least get it down here before you can start to benefit from all these other things you're trying to do. So number one, do be willing to open up and get help. So kind of the two things that I learned and that I want to sort of pass along, not as an authority on the subject, but just as a friend who's saying, hey, this really helped me, is number one, don't be afraid of your fear or really any of your feelings. Don't be afraid of them. So what I learned to do as kind of the beginning of this creative practice, and it's funny because I'm not really a writer. I like to make images, but I started journaling. And I think so much of our journaling sometimes can be about almost like we imagine it to be a social media post. Like, by the time they're finished reading this, they're going to know that I'm amazing. When we journal, we're always looking for a byproduct or something for it to end on. I'd be like, and it's like, if you grew up at the time that I grew up on, Doogie Howser, right? The end of every Doogie Howser episode, he's typing on his word processor because he's so techie and smart. And he's like, what I learned in the past half an hour today was that life can be solved through, that's not what journaling is. That's like keeping an inventory of the person that you wish you were. And that's really frustrating. So the kind of journaling that I'm talking about, it's not the only kind of journaling, but really, it keeps the antenna of your imagination clean, right? So what I learned to do is when I woke up in the morning, before my operating system had completely booting up, sometimes I would just do it right there in bed when I woke up. I had a notebook, I had a pen, and I made a deal with myself. I would fill 2 pages with whatever was going to wind up on those pages. If you think of it as kind of like you've been sleeping and there's been, all these clouds and weather patterns forming in your mind, and some of it's agitating and forming electricity and stuff like that. These morning pages that I wrote were just a way to kind of like let all of that ground, give it a lightning rod, right? So it was not impressive stuff, guys. It was like, I'm really tired. I'm so tired. I wish that I could have another hour of sleep. Boy, am I tired. That makes me frustrated. I wish I wasn't so tired because my day's gonna suck now. Because, that would like I don't know, like probably 75%, 80, 95% of my morning pages were like that. But you have to free yourself from evaluative thinking. What I tricked myself into doing was forming a non-judgmental space for myself. The other thing that I tricked myself into doing was, before my operating system had completely like booted up, all that chatter, all that stuff that was just going on, I gave it a lightning rod, I grounded it to this page, and then I was able to close the notebook and put it back on my nightstand and go into the rest of the day feeling maybe just a little bit clearer. I'd freed up enough space in my imagination so that there was less room for fear to step in at any given moment and say, okay, imagination, you're working for me now, bud. It was just kind of there. And it wasn't like I started acing that or anything like that, but what I noticed was I just started to experience just enough, just a little bit of wiggle room in situations where that chatter, that inner narrative or whatever was going on with the day would immediately grab on and take over. There's just enough wiggle room for me to go, I wonder if there's a different way to look at this situation. And that was just a daily practice. I think maybe after a few years of experiencing that, I'm now finally at a place where I can just go, maybe the conclusion that I want to draw about this situation is not the only conclusion that I could draw. Or I'm just not as exhausted because I'm not carrying all of that weather and that chatter with me into the day. Okay, so that's one. The second one was just to take time to prioritize creative play. I had to be told to do this. This book, The Artist's Way, literally has a covenant that you have to sign in it. And for a dutiful type like me, that's like, because I don't want to break that. That means I'm a bad person if I break that covenant. So I read this thing and I signed it, Adam Hartel. Gonna do this, I'm gonna covenant the crap out of this thing. And then I went out and just started to fail at it, just suck really, really bad. I didn't realize it till now, but like the whole first, 75% of the scriptures is all about a bunch of people who made a covenant with God and then just kept breaking it over and over and over again until somebody came along and said, hey, maybe it's not about doing it perfectly, guys. So that was a little bit of what that journey was like for me. So making space for creative play first looked like taking my 7-year-old self out on a date once a week. I'd set aside a specific amount of time. It was very sacred time. I could not bring anybody with me. I could not overanalyze it, and I had to go with whatever my gut was saying for the day. So it would look something like this. I'm on my day off. There's a lot of things I need to do on my day off, but I'm going to take an hour or two to go on a date with my 7-year-old self. So, Adam, what do you want to do today? Well, I think it would be really cool if we went to Norton Simon and we started looking at blah, 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 and then maybe I could learn some more about and then 7-year-old Adam would be like, let's go to the comic book shop, dude. And I was like, yeah. And I don't have to pay to get into the comic book shop, so that's a good thing. So I would just, it's going to be different for you than it was for me, but it was like, just just look at something that makes you nerd out, or that gives you joy, or just makes you feel like the way that you felt when you were 6 years old and cognitively watching Star Wars for the first time. Because I was in 1977 in the theater as an infant. I was there. But watching it on VHS, understanding what I was looking at, what gives you that electric feeling, That sounds awesome, but it's really hard to do. Why? Because it feels super irresponsible, right? Because creativity and play and imagination, that's a luxury. That's the frosting on the cake. I don't get to do that until I'm doing all this other stuff well, until I'm paying my bills. And that's that hour or two, that's precious time that could be accomplishing a lot more in my life. Or maybe I can kind of hijack it a little bit and make it more responsible, right? Like wanting to use it as an excuse to educate myself or make something better or whatever. So it became this really dysfunctional relationship with my inner child or my inner artist that slowly started to become better. And really what it taught me to do was to listen to that part of myself that still was 7 years old and still was really imaginative and still wanted to play and laugh at things that probably you shouldn't laugh at right now, but you do laugh at it because it's so funny. Being a kid again, right? There's a reason why so much of therapy you hear about a journey like that, right? Because when we're children, we haven't let our executive functioning basically take over everything. We are in a state of trust and joy and play. And I think there's a reason why Jesus taught, be like a child. If you want to live in the state of the kingdom of heaven, if you want to live in a state of liberation, be like a child. He's not saying be childlike, and he's not saying don't be an adult. But I think that big part of recovery and living in a state of freedom is creating just enough space in your life for creative play where you could start to experience that again. And then here's the cool thing that happened, and I do believe does happen because I've heard about it happening for so many people. Basically what we're doing is we're creating like a little safe little playpen for ourselves where we take on some sort of a creative activity. For some, it could be, I don't know, Sudoku, which is like totally not my thing. For others, like myself, it was painting and drawing and trying different things out. And it wasn't drawing something responsible. It was like drawing Star Wars spaceships and lightsabers and Jedi and loving that. And being free from the self-judgment that says, you're freaking 40 years old. Why are you doing this right now? I think when we create that space in our lives to have something creative that we get to play with total suspension of judgment or evaluation, most importantly, self-judgment and evaluation, what it really does is it gives us this private little dojo that we have to start exercising our creative muscles, right? And what I started to discover was I thought that I was doing that in hiding, far away from eyes that could look and go, boy, he's having a midlife crisis right now. I was just enjoying it. But what happened is that muscle and that feeling and that sense of like, whatever, let's just do this, started to kind of start to overflow uncontainably into the rest of my life. And I started experiencing receiving a bill in the mail or really bad news about your taxes or, whatever it is, the stress of life, the things that come up, an argument with my spouse, when my children, who are always perfect angels, were misbehaving, like whatever was going on, there was that little bit of extra space that was kind of like, well, how can we play with this? How can, maybe it's not as bad as you think it is. Or maybe that creative process that you're learning can somehow come in and participate with this. And you can kind of recreate and not let fear manifest its reality for you. So that's it. That's my story. And the thing that I'll part with is something that I talk to a lot of high schoolers about these days, is I talk to them about, hey, these are high schoolers that are wanting to be visual artists. I talk about just draw every day. What software should I learn? You just draw every day. Well, how do I become the best? No, just draw every day. How do I get more followers on Instagram? Just draw every day. And then the question finally boils down to, well, what if I don't feel like drawing? What if when I look at a blank canvas, it's incredibly intimidating? And I'm worried about if I'm going to make good use of that canvas or if I'm even going to like what comes out. What if I'm not feeling it? What if I'm not feeling inspired? I believe, this is my opinion, that inspiration and creativity are not mutually exclusively together. there's a great little hack that you can do. So in my case, it was drawing, okay? I'm not saying it has to be that for you. It could be gardening. It could be, who knows? But I learned to tell myself, okay, look, dude, you're going to draw every day. And you're going to make a deal with yourself. You're going to make a little covenant that says, I will do this for at least 15 minutes every day, even if I don't feel like it, even if there's nothing in me that's like, yay, we get to draw. Even I'm like, I hate this right now. I would sit down, I would get out a blank piece of paper, and I'd just start making marks. And the deal was, if after even 10 minutes or 15 minutes, if I was still just kind of like, this is going nowhere, I'm not feeling it, then it was okay for me to stop. And it was like, I've done what I set out to do today. But if 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 14 minutes and 59 seconds into it, I started going, oh, that's kind of fun. I might. Then the deal was I would ride that wave until I was done. And 15 minutes turned into an hour, or 15 minutes turned into 2 hours sometimes, or 15 minutes turned into, Adam, dinner is being served. You better get your butt to the table, or I am going to burn your notebook. And it really is a hack. Because what you're starting to do is you're trusting that your brain is going to fire neurons, and the creative machine that is designed to make connections that were not there before can go into effect if you just put it in a situation where it needs to do that. And you start regaining your sense of creativity. You start regaining the trust in the fact that you are a creative person and that you can adapt and that you can come up with new ways of looking at something and that you can be a better spouse for the partner that you're with. And I think that that's hope. And I think that even though I still suck at a lot of that stuff, I am able to today live in a state of liberation, that I know that I can keep growing, and that I might not be fully satisfied with the painting I just finished, but you know what? I'm going to start another one, and it's going to be better than this one. And that's really what I want to do today, is just invite all of us to live in that state. And a great way to do it is just find something that the 7-year-old in you wants to do and give a little bit of time to it and enjoy it. Yeah. To do the obligatory quarantining of the microphone. Sorry, I've never done this before. Nobody else. Mike. Thanks for your patience, Jasmine. All right. All right, cool. Thanks, everybody.
Wow. Thank you, Adam, for sharing your life with us. Really, not just inspiring in the way that you were just talking about as only coinciding with creativity, but a good charge for us as we continue on in our journey toward in a state of liberation, right? We're there. So I love that. I did just want to say, I know we had a slight interruption in our stream, and that we will be posting Adam's full message without any stops in its entirety very shortly. So thanks for sticking with us. But I just want to pray a blessing over us out of what Adam shared. I believe that was an important word for us this morning. So God of creativity, as we open our eyes, open our lives to you, we want to see even better. We want to see the ways that you have created us from the time that we were children. You've given us a birthright of creativity to be your partners in this world, in who we are. So on our community, Lord, I speak a releasing of creativity, that we would not be in a state of failure of imagination, but that your life in us would be bringing forth new life. Would you bless those families, those individuals, our communities, with that sight to see the creative, the new work that you're doing, Lord. We bring all of this to you. Bring us together in that bond as well, so that we can share, we can be that encouragement, we can be the help for those who need it, and we can be the people that say, no, this is in you, I'm with you in it, and we're doing this together. So thank you, God, for your love in our lives. We open ourselves to that today, and we go forth to embrace that creative play that is a part of the world you've given us, Lord. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Go in peace. We'll see you next week. God bless you. And kids, we'll see you next week for our Kids Caravan. Awesome. See you soon.